Good afternoon to everyone joining us today. We warmly welcome you from FININTEGRA to the webinar Structural Corruption: Challenges for the Prevention and Fight Against Money Laundering. Thank you for joining us and for dedicating your time to a space that does not seek immediate answers, but rather critical reflection, intersectoral dialogue, and the construction of impactful and sustainable solutions. Today we are called by an unavoidable urgency, the need to look at corruption beyond isolated cases and headlines. We are talking about structures that uphold impunity, of sophisticated ways of appropriating the public sphere, and, in our field, of how all this is linked with the financial system and the risks of money laundering. At FININTEGRA, we believe in the power of well-founded ideas, in technical analysis with an ethical sense, and in the strength of collective thinking. That's why this space connects the theory of double fraud and the analysis of structural corruption proposed by our guest with the concrete challenges faced by those of us working for financial integrity. We are honored to have the participation of Dr. Irma Eréndira Sandoval, a researcher at the Institute of Social Research of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, university professor and author of Structural Corruption, a work that is already provoking an essential debate in our region. I also thank the entire FININTEGRA team and those who will be joining us for this webinar today. We hope this meeting inspires you, inspires ideas, questions, and possible paths. Welcome, everyone. It is an honor to have you here and now to start this conversation. I hand over the floor to Fernando Martínez, our moderator for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, milady. Good afternoon to everyone connected to this webinar. As you rightly said, it is an important space for critical reflection and with a distinguished guest, Dr. Irma Eréndira Sandoval Ballesteros, who will talk to us about structural corruption and its implications in the fight against money laundering. And also, of course, our specialist Enrique Nort, who will show how this structural corruption approach is applied in current schemes of compliance and prevention of money laundering. Personally, I admire Dr. Irma Eréndira Sandoval Ballesteros in various aspects, academically, professionally, and of course, personally. That's why it's a pleasure for me that she is in this space sharing her ideas and contributing, as always, brilliant ideas about fighting corruption. I will allow myself to make a brief presentation on the experience and academic background of Dr. Irma Eréndira Sandoval. She is a researcher at the Institute of Social Research of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, where she founded and currently coordinates the Laboratory of Documentation and Analysis of Corruption and Transparency. She holds a degree in economics from the Faculty of Economics of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, a degree in sociology from the Metropolitan Autonomous University, a master's degree in Latin American Studies from the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and a master's and doctoral degree in political science from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Dr. Sandoval is a national researcher of the National System of Researchers of Mexico at Level 3. She has distinctions such as the first place of the Manuel Espinosa Iglesias Award for her research on corruption in the financial system, the Edmund J. Safra Fellowships from Harvard University, the Reagan Fussell Democracy Fellowship from the International Forum for Democratic Studies in Washington, D.C. She has been a teacher and researcher at major national and international universities, including the Institute of Higher Studies for Latin America in France, American University in Washington, and Harvard University. She received the Alfonso Reyes Chair for Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, granted by the Sorbonne University in Paris. Dr. Sandoval was a constituent deputy of the Constituent Assembly of Mexico City, where she was a member of the board of the Commission of Good Government, Combating Corruption, and the Public Officials Responsibility Regime. Between 2018 and 2021, she served as the Secretariat of Public Administration of the Government of Mexico and was a representative of the executive power in the Coordinating Committee of the National Anti-Corruption System, president of the Permanent Commission of Controllers, States, Federation, President of the Governing Committee of the National Oversight System, and President of the Specialized Technical Committee on Corruption Information of the National Institute of Statistics and Geography, INEGI. Among her most important works are Structural Corruption, The Theory of Double Fraud and Roots of Impunity in Mexico, Corruption and Transparency, Debating the Boundaries Between State, Market, and Society, Crisis, Rentism, and Neoliberal Interventionism in Banking, Relaunching of the Secretariat of Public Administration and Public Interest, Public-Private Partnerships, and De facto Powers. Without further ado, I hand the microphone to Dr. Irma Eréndira Sandoval Ballesteros for her presentation on structural corruption and its implications in money laundering. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fernando Martínez. It is truly a great pleasure that you kindly introduce me in this way and that you be the moderator of this wonderful panel, which I feel very fortunate to participate in because I understand that it is the launch of a great project. Fernando mentioned it to me beforehand, and it sounds like there's a lot of work ahead, and above all, a very promising path. I wish the entire FININTEGRA team the very best of success. It is a great initiative, very innovative, but also very urgent in our country, as you will hear with the comments that we are going to offer here. And I want to thank, of course, the presentation and greeting from Milady Bernal Campos, whom I also had the pleasure of meeting beforehand. Also greetings to Enrique Nort, also here with us, with whom I understand there will be a more formal conversation regarding these topics, which I hope will generate interest in those who are following us in this webinar. Thank you very much to FININTEGRA. Well, yes, as you can hear, I'm passionate about it. I'm interested, and I've dedicated my life to these topics of accountability, particularly to accountability in terms of, let's say, ethics and financial or asset probity, but evidently from an academically theoretical approach that also already had, let's say, its moment of praxis when we were working together with Fernando and other colleagues as well on the internal control at the federal level in the Secretariat of the Public Administration. So we have already had, let's say, some elements of success and of applying the theoretical approach that I want to explain today to your colleagues at FININTEGRA and to those following this important webinar. Corruption in theoretical terms, well, rather in practical terms, corruption as a societal phenomenon has proven to be immune to political changes and the great transformations of our country. All the evaluations indicate that not even that important, iconic moment of, let's say, the democratic transition of the late 1990s, the political alternation already in the year 2000, or our so-called fourth transformation from 2018 to 2019, could really eliminate the presence of corruption in a structural way. Quite the opposite. Unfortunately, in recent years, we have seen how this phenomenon has taken root in certain aspects, and this, unfortunately, is not exclusive to our nation, but is happening throughout the Latin American region and around the world. For this reason, for this conversation, this webinar, I propose to present for your consideration this theoretical approach that we have developed over the years for its study, for the study of corruption. This approach is the approach of structural corruption, which invites us to analyze social issues, particularly democracy, justice, and of course social change in a structural way. The structural corruption approach argues that corruption seen this way as structural, particularly the one that originates from the elites, political and financial or political and economic, is not an accident. It is not an accident that sporadically and suddenly appears in an unfortunate manner, but unfortunately, as we are going to demonstrate, is an inherent feature, and let's say very constant in the political structures that exist in our country. That's why we call it structural. I maintain in my work that the approaches that have been applied in a more practical way in public policy to combat corruption, but also the theoretical approaches used to study it, have been very, very limited, somewhat biased, overly focused, and I would even say benevolent with capitalism in its neoliberal phase. Most of the academic literature on corruption is based on two, limited methodological premises. On one hand, it is asserted that corruption is found exclusively in the public and governmental sector, and evidently in a fatalistic manner, they link the public, the governmental, to waste, inefficiency, and evidently to corruption. And the second premise, equally problematic, is that corruption would be a matter of bad apples, a strictly individual behavior, a matter of good and bad, and therefore the task of the inspectors, the auditors, and not to mention those who pursue and seek to punish corruption, is to locate those individual, isolated, and bad apple behaviors. In my proposal, it is that we are in a very complex crisis. They have called it a polycrisis. Evidently, it is a crisis. Economic, financial, environmental, even geopolitical, given the numerous armed conflicts currently unfolding across the globe. And I think it's a very good time to seek new heuristic tools. Today we can see that corruption is not just about bad apples and individuals, nor just about governments or public issues, but the corruption that does not cease, that is perennial, as we said, that lingers after great transformations. This corruption affects the state, of course, but also the market, the state, the market, and those who pay the most are us, society. So state, market, and society are overshadowed by the phenomena of corruption. And this exists in those societies called the global north, where supposedly there is growth, where there is a bit more economic prosperity. These corrupt practices also occur. Evidently, corruption is also present in the global south, and therefore it is unavoidable to analyze it differently. Corruption, it was said, could be fought by privatizing, by eliminating public inefficacy and inefficiency and privatizing quickly. Evidently, these prescriptions had their momentum and were completely consistent with the arrival of the fleeting and apparent triumph of neoliberalism in the world, when, in those moments of the whirlwind of the era, of the fall of the Berlin Wall, in the post-Soviet era, emerges the defense of a notion of democracy subject to the market, of a notion of electoral democracy financed. And I say this because it will connect with another fundamental concept of my work, of my argument, which has to do with these topics, which is the double fraud. But then this notion of democracy subjected to the market was the epitome of the fleeting triumph of neoliberalism. And there, the financial institutions, along with other globalist think tanks, pushed into the public agenda, on the political agenda, this whole issue of transparency, accountability, and even very important concepts like public ethics. But they built and vindicated an anti-corruption discourse, particularly concerned or centered on this, privatizing vision as the sole solution to the issue of corruption and its diverse issues. We, from the perspective of structural corruption, point out private actors precisely as central subjects in acts of corruption, which is fundamental today more than ever because it is usually stated, as I was saying, that public officials are the main ones responsible, completely absolving the private sector of responsibility. Likewise, it is essential to remember when this type of argument tends to be generated that individuals never act alone, and that evidently they generally have political backing in the case of private actors from their companies to carry out these illicit acts, these illicit payments, or these actions that, even if they aren't illicit, that's the most important part from the structural corruption perspective. Even if they are, let's say, covered by legality, they stem from a very questionable ethic. What I mean is that even in the global north, there's a form of legality where profits are prioritized over proper practices. And that shows that the individual is always, in one way or another, engaging in acts of corruption. Or when such acts supposedly occur on an individual level, the corporation still benefits, especially when the person is acting as a representative of the market. In academic terms, I maintain that after the disastrous crisis of 1929, the so-called crash of 29, the American sociologist Edwin Sutherland revolutionized the intellectual world with his thesis on white-collar crimes, which today we all know. And in a very important conference, he argued that according to his research, large economic corporations permanently violated existing laws, particularly in the areas of taxation, antitrust, customs regulations, and consumer protection. Obviously, they trampled over labor relations and financial manipulations. All this was pointed out by this thinker, and he also mentioned that these crimes were neither investigated nor often even reported. This greatly inspired me to build my own construct of the structural corruption approach, because one of its fundamental themes is precisely, as we will see later, impunity. So, based on these theses, both the validity of the official crime statistics being compiled at that time, in the 1930s, was called into question, as well as the diagnoses that generally accepted the origins of corruption and crime. And that typically blamed, back then, poverty and lack of education. And, as Sutherland pointed out, on conditions like overcrowding. And it is in that same spirit that we draw inspiration, as I was saying, for the development of this approach to structural corruption, which precisely questions those premises, but many others that were generated to explain corruption in our times. We question the premises, typical methodological approaches of traditional corruptology, and, well, we assert several issues. First, that structural corruption trickles down from the highest levels of the social pyramid. It does not necessarily originate, as is commonly claimed, from lower social and economic strata. It's not just a problem of low-level public officials stuffing their pockets at the expense of ordinary citizens, or the traffic officer on the corner at the stoplight. No, it's not about bribes and handouts. And precisely, the fight against it should focus on much more radical, much more structural strategies than those post-culturalist approaches, which were also very much in vogue. Things like re-education and rerouting. Because what we were saying, what we continue to say from this structural corruption perspective is that corruption is a problem that demands equally structural solutions. Another key concept we work with is the idea of state capture by rent-seeking economic interests. And it's precisely within that hierarchical pyramidal structure that unfortunately characterizes us in Mexico, where the bureaucrats, as we demonstrate with very precise research, will even be forced to extort citizens, either by orders from their superiors or due to the political and even organizational inertia that develops in the public sector. So in facing this worrying scenario of corruption, and as I mentioned before, of impunity, this issue must be taken more seriously. We believe that some approaches have been, the culturalist approach is, I hope, already behind us. Although, well, there are still many traces that return to this victimization or re-victimization of those who truly bear the cost of corruption, which are the most vulnerable people. And we also think that the purely normative or administrative approach, while important, I myself am a fan of working towards a truly ethical new legality and against structural corruption. But if it remains purely at the normative or administrative level, we're not going to approach the problem of structural corruption in a complex or meaningful way. Another central element from this approach I present for this conversation is the double fraud theory. We speak of a fraud with two faces, like a coin with two sides, one political electoral and the other economic financial. In other words, corruption is not only about the appropriation, it is, let's say, the theft of public resources for private purposes, or let's say this abuse of the economic financial resources that belong to everyone. But there's also another side, a defrauding of the popular will, a defrauding of democracy itself, which is very, very dangerous in our times. Because this political electoral fraud is intrinsically linked with economic financial fraud, and this has generated these complex phenomena that I already mentioned of structural corruption. I wonder in my books, in the works that I've presented recently, why under neoliberalism an increase in electoral competitiveness tends to go hand in hand with more corruption. And it is precisely because of the action of this double defraudation mechanism of double fraud, where economic financial interests abuse their power to simultaneously manipulate, on one hand, the electoral results and looting the public coffers, but all under a veil of democracy, of widespread impunity, which is what operates as the shield that protects structural corruption. Precisely for that reason, and in contrast to what is proposed by subject-centered theories or the subjectivist theory, and of course by the culturalist and individualist theories of corruption, I offer an analysis of corruption as a deep structure that articulates this double fraud. On the one hand, by undermining democracy, which is deeply, deeply concerning, and on the other, by installing rent-seeking and clientelism as modes of governance. So there's broad agreement that corruption involves the absence of controls. Controls that are, of course, institutional, political, and social, which would restrain the abuse of power. But what I emphasize from my theoretical construct, the structural corruption approach, to explain corruption understood this way: as a structural problem, we must not focus solely on formally instituted power. The real centers of power are often not located within traditional institutions. Within the visible institutions, or the tripartite division of powers, they taught us back in elementary school, right? But rather in other kinds of power. And we really need to locate the core of those other powers that inhabit, are produced, and are reproduced within institutions. but also outside of them. And clearly, as you know, I'm referring here to de facto powers. Those who, in complicity with the formally established powers, steadily undermine institutional credibility. In my work, I offer a very precise conceptualization of structural corruption, right? Everyone puts forward their own concepts, and mine is the following. Corruption is a specific form of social domination sustained by a structural power imbalance in which abuse, impunity, and the improper appropriation of citizens' resources prevail. That is my definition in theoretical terms, let's say, because I do want to ground it in a specific historical moment. That's why it's specific. It's historical, not transhistorical. There's no reason it has to be permanent or always present. And because corruption is historical, its concrete practices take on a wide variety of forms. What I do point out is that these become more visible during periods in which the relationship between the state and society is broken, when society doesn't see itself reflected in its state, and when the state is not in constant dialogue with its society. So these are the main elements of the theoretical construct I am offering. I also argue that today, while some examples of structural corruption do include, as I said, criminal and illicit behavior, like the ones we'll discuss a bit more in depth later on, money laundering stands out as one of the most ominous phenomena in our societies. But while some examples of structural corruption are directly criminal and illicit, there are other practices associated with the phenomenon of structural corruption, which can be, as I was saying, perfectly legal, but evidently also of questionable morality. In this sense, structural corruption shouldn't be reduced solely to a legalist approach. As I mentioned earlier, but should also be seen as a sociological issue that can emerge. And this is something very important to highlight, not only from the public sphere. I'm not saying the public sphere suddenly becomes a space of purity. We know that the public sphere must be constantly monitored, audited, and made transparent. But this social domain, this domain of power, can also emerge from the private sphere. And that's why structural corruption, for the purposes of its definition, places no particular emphasis on whether it originates in the public or private sphere. If the private sphere is the core from which power emerges, whether that power is de facto or not, it's essential that we begin to audit and regulate it. So then, to recap, our approach emphasizes three fundamental elements of dysfunctional governance. First, social domination. As we've said, it is grounded in that structural power imbalance where the abuse of power prevails, regardless of whether it originates in the public or private sphere. Secondly, impunity. The impunity of the highest levels of power, and I repeat, not only public power, but also economic power. Today, the highest levels of power often belong to the private sector, especially in a context where most services have been privatized throughout Latin America. In Mexico, that's the direction we're heading, or in many ways, where we already are. And when these private sectors do not take responsibility for the obligations they are meant to fulfill. First of all, since the 1980s and 1990s, state actors have abdicated functions traditionally assigned to the public sector. As a result, it is now the private sector that carries them out, which directly affects the fundamental rights of citizens. This is why the second element of my framework is the impunity of the public sphere, but especially that of the private sector. And thirdly, a fundamental issue is the civic voice, the voice of the citizens, and social exclusion, or rather the expropriation of that civic voice, which creates this disconnection, as I mentioned earlier, between the state and society. It generates a profound distancing of society from its representatives, its judges, and its government officials. And not only that, but also a sense of democratic disenchantment, which is another phenomenon that has been widely studied in contemporary sociology and political science. It is precisely this disenchantment that gives rise to charismatic yet authoritarian leaders, or leaders who carry non-democratic agendas. In this context, democratic disenchantment, linked to what I call a double betrayal, leads directly to very dangerous political scenarios. Therefore, these three elements, abuse of power, impunity, and social exclusion, are, in my view, reflected in a de facto cancellation of access to power. For citizens, also access to justice and access to representation are effectively denied. As we mentioned, democracy itself is ultimately undermined. I'm not sure how we're doing on time. Could you let me know, Fernando, please?
Yes, Doctor. 10 more minutes to conclude your initial remarks, please.
Magnificent, magnificent. Well, as we were saying, the issue is political in terms of its structure. In Mexico, we have experienced a hegemony of a system of groups, of cliques, as they were called, right? The informal domination by groups from the political and financial elite produces a toxic mix between the electoral sphere and the financial sphere, which leads to the expansion and consolidation of this system of structural corruption. This double fraud, I believe, is important to understand, and above all, to confront, because the structural financial fraud operates in favor of enrichment, of a privileged elite, is closely tied to the political electoral fraud that operates in favor of the entrenchment power of the political actors serving those financial elites. This directly hinders the development of our society, and this double fraud is also linked to a much deeper reflection that access to power is only possible through access to wealth, and conversely, wealth becomes the direct stepping stone to power in this context of double betrayal. Evidently, these reflections maintain that, I want to emphasize that the issue of structural corruption is profoundly serious because it is linked to various forms of fraud. Not only electoral frauds, which have traditionally occurred in our country, Mexico, in recent years, but also financial frauds that are extremely serious, not only for Mexico, but for the world. We have all, as citizens of the world, been direct witnesses of the growing increase in financial indebtedness, where, again, we see not only a lack of liquidity in this economic financial crisis. It is not merely a matter of insufficient liquidity to pay or meet debts, whether by citizens or by political actors, but rather a broader strategy of subordinating economic decisions and political decisions, both at the national and international levels, to the dictates of financial definitions. What I mean by this is that we are not merely facing a temporary liquidity shortage, but rather a structural problem. It is a matter of abusive leveraging of excessively overvalued financial assets within a permanent speculative bubble. So this is what is happening at the international level, even at the level of global geopolitics. And evidently, this financial speculation, this leveraging of certain assets that in general are worth nothing, but that are inflated and generate speculative bubbles. The counterpart of this is the other face of the double fraud, where, I repeat, the other side is the betrayal of the popular voice, of the popular will, the political electoral fraud in which citizens choose A, but B is imposed on them. And with that, the cycle returns to the beginning, feeding the financial fraud and delegitimizing democracies, and turning political actors into mere subjects of neoliberalism. I would now like to turn to the issue of impunity and connect it to what we previously discussed regarding money laundering, along with the topics we proposed when we were in public office to address the issue of money laundering directly. If you'll allow me just a few more minutes. So then, the increasingly dangerous and deep connection between the structural corruption I was referring to and organized crime financial capital is clear, right? Unfortunately, Mexico has come to be seen as one of the countries most impacted by these criminal dynamics. The UN has already indicated that the annual profits for transnational criminal networks that launder money through the international financial system exceed $1 trillion, which is equivalent to the wealth of the 50 least developed countries in the world. In Mexico, the conservative and cautious estimate calculated by fiscal authorities indicates that drug trafficking launders between $30 and $35 billion annually. This is an incredibly large amount, and Mexico's international position is particularly serious because it is a member of the OECD. In other words, Mexico is one of the primary targets, one of the most important targets, when it comes to this type of financial criminality, where
grande y precisamente es grave nuestra posición internacional porque México es parte de la OCDE. Es decir, México es el país que tiene de los mayores blancos. Es uno de los blancos más importantes en términos de esta.
money laundering is done and where money laundering is most forgiven. You may remember those historical cases where the United States government forgives HSBC for laundering money in Mexico. And at the same time, within the OECD, Mexico has
HSBC por haber lavado dinero en México y al mismo tiempo tiene dentro de la OCDE
very troubling figures in terms of tax collection. Mexico has one of the lowest tax collection rates among OECD countries. Between 2021 and 2024, there was an increase in tax collection of 2 percentage points. However, the level of tax collection we have in Mexico has nothing to do with the percentages seen in the OECD. For example, we can mention Denmark, France, and Belgium, which have tax collection rates of 46%, 45%, and 44% of their national income, respectively. In contrast, Mexico's meager level of tax collection is highly unfavorable, even when compared to developing countries or sister nations in Latin America, such as Argentina or Chile, where we are consistently well below the tax rates of those countries and far from the OECD average in terms of tax collection. Because if we joined that organization, it was precisely to keep pushing ourselves toward development. Yet here, it seems we're being dragged into a downward spiral in these terms. The central point from the perspective of structural corruption that I want to make here is that banks and financial institutions are not the victims. Rather, we could say they are even the main actors responsible for and beneficiaries of the complete lack of control over money laundering in Mexico. As I mentioned earlier, we recall the case of the U.S. financial authorities who discovered that the bank, Wachovia, was engaged in laundering a sum equivalent to 1/3 of Mexico's gross domestic product, that is, over $400 billion, which came from drug trafficking and belonged to Mexican drug cartels. And evidently, these phenomena eventually led to the disappearance and absorption of the Wachovia conglomerate by the other financial conglomerate, Wells Fargo, in the year 2008. Mexico has also faced very serious financial scandals, such as those linked to the 2012 presidential elections, involving financial consortiums of the Monex Group, which had already been implicated in numerous money laundering scandals prior to 2012. I will conclude with the issue of impunity. The United States Congress has documented at countless occasions how banks, I repeat, are very active players in this issue of money laundering. And this is also troubling for our relationship with the United States, because within this same framework of structural corruption and the hierarchical pyramidal organization it creates, we are positioned at the bottom, so to speak, in the relationship with the United States. And these cases, in which private impunity is particularly problematic, are especially evident in the banking sector, due to the recurrence with which financial corporations, in collusion with authorities, commit the same offenses, unfortunately, cycle after cycle. Since 2012, I remember that on December 11, 2012, the Department of Justice of the United States granted that historic pardon to HSBC Bank for its involvement in the broad, vast, and troubling case of money laundering originating from the drug cartels in Mexico, as well as terrorist groups from the Middle East that were laundering money in Mexico and using that wealth to destabilize democracy in the United States. That same bank, HSBC, continues to operate with impunity, and years later was once again linked to another case involving its open collusion with a vast money laundering network, known as the Swiss Leaks case. So, well, we could go on indefinitely with cases, but what we proposed was to promote policies. And here, I return to the more practical side of international cooperation to combat tax havens. What is needed is not only national security cooperation in military terms, but also collaboration based on accurate information. It is also important to strengthen, indeed, I would say, tighten banking system controls on money laundering through close and thorough investigations aimed at shutting down shell companies and cleansing the system of such entities. This includes real estate audits in the United States. And something Fernando can attest to, something we strongly advocated for while in public office, was a law on financial conflicts of interest, a field where such conflicts are widespread. A fundamental issue that has yet to be achieved is the elimination of tax consolidation programs and, more broadly, greater discipline in combating tax-related crimes, such as tax evasion, and full transparency in asset declarations. Well, one of the most basic issues on which no real progress has been made is the elimination of banking, fiduciary, and tax secrecy in the investigation of tax crimes and illicit financial practices. It should be taken for granted that banking, tax, and trade secrecy must be lifted in such cases. So these are some of the points I wanted to share with you this afternoon, and I submit these reflections for your consideration. My sincere thanks to Fernando, Enrique, and Milady.
Thank you very much, Doctor. As always, it's a pleasure to hear you. You always make us reflect. And that critical perspective you bring consistently inspires us to engage in these kinds of reflections and events so that we can join forces in the fight against structural corruption. And as you rightly point out, we must not remain focused only on bribes or petty handouts at street level, right? There is an entire system, powerful circles that seize control of institutions and act in their own interest. Without a doubt, your critical approach is extremely valuable in shaping comprehensive anti-corruption strategies. And before we move into the discussion and exchange of ideas, we would like to begin with the remarks of Enrique Nort. Specifically, how he sees the structural corruption approach being applied within current compliance and anti-money laundering frameworks. So that, as you rightly said, it does not remain purely theoretical in the academic sphere, which you strongly promoted during your time at the then Ministry of Public Administration. This approach led to several strategies aimed at dismantling, at least to some extent, this structural corruption. But, well, we'll return to that reflection shortly. Let's listen to Enrique Nort, and before that, I'll take a moment to introduce him. Enrique Nort is an economist and holds a master's degree in international management from ITOM. He has worked for 35 years in the international financial sector in Mexico, Canada, Singapore, and Hong Kong. As part of the Egmont Group of Financial Intelligence Units, he participated in financial intelligence projects in various parts of the world. He maintained coordination with the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, and provided training to Interpol agents on specific typologies related to financial crimes. He also took part in financial investigation projects involving laundromat schemes in Eastern Europe, as well as efforts to combat terrorism financing in Central and West Africa. He led the Global Anti-Money Laundering Investigations Unit at Citigroup for Latin America and the Caribbean, overseeing teams across several countries in the region. He conducted training and outreach activities on anti-money laundering typologies and counter-terrorism financing for compliance officers at leading financial institutions in Latin America. At Mexico's National Banking and Securities Commission, he was responsible for coordinating the financial supervisory activities of foreign financial authorities in Mexico, including the U.S. Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions of Canada. He participated in various working groups of the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, as well as in the NAML expert group of the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. He was also a member of the drafting group for the FATF methodology used to assess compliance with its 40 recommendations. He was a member of the Financial Services Committee under the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and he currently serves as a specialist in the financial sector and international cooperation at FININTEGRA. He also collaborates on various anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing initiatives with public and private entities at the international level. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Enrique, and to hear your insights, as always. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fernando, for that introduction. It is an honor to share this space with you, Irma Eréndira, and with our colleagues from FININTEGRA. My thanks as well to all the participants. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today and to try to share some thoughts on the concepts presented by Irma Eréndira, which are incredibly rich. Her work is conceptually dense and offers a great deal to reflect on. It would be overly ambitious on my part to try to address all of them, but I would like to revisit some and explore how we might ground them within the perspective we have as compliance officers in the financial sector in the field of compliance. How some of the concepts and premises shared by Irma Eréndira can help enrich the analysis and broaden the perspective that, at the end of the day, compliance officers in the financial sector must have, since in a way they are also meant to be the guarantors of integrity. The role of the compliance officer at the end of the day is that of a watchdog, a gatekeeper in a way, of the integrity of transactions. So it is critically important, I think, to enrich this role, broaden its perspectives, and try to align, so to speak, some of the concepts shared by Irma Eréndira, with the perspectives and frameworks commonly used in the field of compliance. I'm going to briefly share a few slides with you, if you'll allow me just a moment. I am going to share this. Perfect. I don't know if you can see my screen.
I think not yet.
Let's see. Okay. I think that's it. Yes, I missed clicking there.
All right, perfect.
Ready, wonderful. So, I want to keep the presentation fairly concise, mainly to allow time for a richer and broader exchange with Irma Eréndira, as well as for some questions from the participants. I've selected these concepts to present an expanded approach to corruption from a compliance perspective, drawing specifically on these ideas. We're going to briefly go over the following ideas: the traditional approach to corruption in financial institutions, and the expanded perspective on corruption, precisely incorporating these concepts. The need, perhaps, to rethink investigative processes, in this case, referring to what financial institutions typically call investigations, meaning internal analysis procedures. We are not referring here to judicial investigations. Also, the importance of reporting by financial institutions in cases of corruption. We will also share some categories of corruption indicators, red flags, that financial institutions can detect, and finally highlight the fundamental key role of financial intelligence units in this fight against corruption. So, I'll now move on to explain or share briefly what the traditional approach entails. Anti-corruption efforts have usually or traditionally been focused on PEPs. What are PEPs? Politically exposed persons, individuals who currently hold or have previously held prominent public positions. This focus is not without reason. It stems from an obligation under the FATF's 40 recommendations, which require special consideration to be given to PEPs, as they represent a particular risk. So, what is the impact of this? Well, it directly affects client risk classification. These PEP clients must be classified according to the level of risk they represent to the institution, and this commonly entails the application of enhanced due diligence measures. It also has an impact on transaction monitoring systems, since, when analyzing the transactional flow of clients, these systems must take into account the special designation assigned to PEPs and pay particular attention to their transaction flows and the operations they carry out. What I find interesting here is the expanded perspective on corruption, and some of the factors mentioned by Irma Eréndira can be considered in this context. For example, the possibility of including other actors in transactions and in acts of corruption. This does not necessarily revolve around the public official or public figure. Rather, there is an entire set of complementary entities involved. We can approach this first from a transactional perspective. For example, conducting a detailed analysis of who the transactional counterparts of PEPs, politically exposed persons, are, and also closely examining the ultimate beneficiaries of those counterparts. In many cases, there is a network of legal entities that interact with PEPS. We have seen, and as Irma Eréndira mentioned a moment ago, the existence of shell companies, for example. It is essential to conduct a detailed analysis of the ultimate beneficiaries of the counterparts, and just as importantly, to consider all non-transactional approaches or possibilities that can enrich this analysis. For example, making use of open sources, both public and private. A more sophisticated analysis that financial institutions can carry out involves gathering open source information and identifying scandals such as those Irma Eréndira mentioned a moment ago. Another very interesting element is the identification of linked third parties. And here I believe this is one way of capturing what the doctor was referring to earlier. All those entities and forces that in one way or another operate around the public official, at the end of the day, we can translate them into entities that are, typologically speaking, well-defined. For example, certain service providers within the FATF methodology deserve special attention, such as fiduciary and corporate service providers. For example, entities that facilitate or are specifically intended to create companies and provide corporate services to other entities. In corruption scandals, particularly transnational ones, we've seen, and I'm thinking of certain cases in Eastern Europe, how these firms were at the center of creating entire constellations of shell companies. These operated in collusion with very specific financial institutions. In Eastern Europe, whose purpose was to launder money originating from third countries and introduce it into the European Union's banking system. These types of cases have been observed quite frequently. They are not transactional counterparts, but rather service providers involved in the process. Also, the so-called regulated non-financial professions or regulated non-financial actors, such as notaries, real estate brokers, and a wide range of other activities whose regulation varies depending on the country, play a role or can serve as channels either to facilitate money laundering or conversely to help prevent it. So we must also take into account the role these other actors play. And finally, there is the information provided by what in English is called the whistleblowers, or the informants in a way. These actors are treated differently depending on the country, but what has been observed is that in some cases they have helped uncover major corruption schemes and significant mismanagement or embezzlement of resources within financial institutions themselves. So this is another important aspect to take into consideration. This leads us to rethink, in some way, the internal investigative processes within financial institutions. For example, we should reconsider how alerts are generated and handled. Are we truly capturing everything we should? Can we enhance those processes to better address the phenomenon of corruption? Today, we are seeing an expansion in the use of technologies that were once considered cutting edge, but are now very much current. For example, tools that incorporate artificial intelligence, models that learn from data usage and handle large volumes of data, can significantly enhance transactional monitoring scenarios. On the one hand, we can train these monitoring systems using the various typologies that have been identified, including corruption cases involving multiple actors, so that these models can more accurately detect acts of corruption. And we also have these same tools to help us filter out false positives. Often these automated systems that process large volumes of transactions can generate a significant number of false positives. So these same artificial intelligence tools can assist in ruling them out. These tools are already being adopted by both financial institutions and financial intelligence units in various parts of the world. They are tools that can enable more accurate and precise analysis, allowing us to identify risks and potential illicit activities more effectively. An additional point is the need to re-examine the case opening processes for investigations related to corruption. That is, within financial institutions, there is initially a first phase of alert generation. Many of these alerts end up being closed when they are deemed not to be actionable. The next phase involves the opening of investigation cases. So, are we doing this correctly? Perhaps we should consider opening additional investigation cases specifically for instances of corruption. I believe these are the kinds of reflections that can be constructive within the compliance officer community. The importance of reporting in cases of corruption. These reports are, so to speak, the fuel, the essential tool that financial intelligence units rely on. Reports are an obligation of intermediaries and are fundamental for intelligence units to precisely create this financial intelligence. Financial institutions must report effectively, and by effectively, I mean in several respects. For example, they must report transactions they detect in a timely manner as quickly as possible, but this also involves a sense of responsibility. In some financial institutions, we have occasionally seen what we call a defensive reporting attitude. That is, in case of doubt, they report a large volume of information that ultimately does little more than overwhelm the financial intelligence unit with low-quality data. It's important for financial institutions to conduct a thorough internal analysis and, whenever possible, provide enriched information to the financial intelligence unit. For example, it is far more valuable for the unit to receive a mapped-out corruption network from a financial institution. As we mentioned earlier, if the financial intelligence unit reports that a public official is receiving funds from Citizen A, and that this same Citizen A is also providing funds to public official B and to yet another official, then we have a non-public actor, a private individual who is essentially channeling resources to a series of public officials at various levels of government, and so on. Providing that network directly to the financial intelligence unit can be extremely valuable and can greatly facilitate the task of detecting and mitigating risks within the system. That's what I mean by the possibility of enriching these reports. Very briefly, a few categories of corruption indicators or red flags that can be used. Those related to financial transactions and fund flows. Transactions that are inconsistent with the client's financial profile or habits, such as large amounts received or paid to individuals or legal entities, cash deposits or withdrawals with unusual frequency or in atypical amounts without any apparent justification, immediate transfers of funds from a private entity to the personal account of a public official, followed by movement of those funds to third-party accounts or overseas, transfers between companies with the same name or to offshore structures sometimes linked to public officials, the use of mechanisms similar to Hawala by public officials. Hawala is an informal system for transferring money, often outside of regulated financial channels. It is a system that originated in the Middle East and parts of Asia several hundred years ago. and in recent times it has been misused as an informal method to transfer money without going through regulated, monitored financial channels. Rapid investment and disinvestment of funds in an account without a known source of the funds. These are some categories of red flags or indicators we can keep in mind. Other indicators relate to third parties and intermediaries, such as excessive commissions or unusually large discounts given to agents, intermediaries, or consultants. Consulting contracts with very vaguely described services, something we have often observed. In some cases, the external consultant performs a different activity than the one they were officially hired for, and there is a third party closely associated with a public official abroad. The third party becomes involved at the request or insistence of a foreign official, and these are also cases we have seen with some frequency. The use of shell companies or offshore entities, these are major vehicles for obscuring the origin and destination of funds, and these shell companies or offshore structures appear repeatedly in financial scandals across the region, linked to both public and private actors seeking to conceal the handling of funds. The use of euphemisms for bribes, like with key words, for example, commission, marketing fees, surcharges, fees, etc., are certain euphemisms, certain words that can be detected when filling out transactional information, and that intelligence units sometimes use to track transactions. The use of front men or figureheads, once again as a way to obscure the ultimate beneficiaries. This is also a typology we have seen time and again in the region, and one that is commonly used in many parts of the world. Another one is the evasion of the due diligence process. As we mentioned, financial institutions are required to carry out due diligence and know their clients. But this is sometimes circumvented through third parties who agree to open accounts that ultimately are intended to manage funds on behalf of someone else. This is sometimes done to avoid enhanced due diligence processes that would otherwise apply to a PEP. Politically exposed persons may use such tactics to manage their funds without triggering the detection mechanisms we mentioned earlier. An additional category includes indicators related to the PEPs themselves and their surrounding networks. Public officials, whether domestic or foreign, who receive or send unusually large amounts of funds received in accounts held by individuals or entities with no visible connection to the public officials, but which are known to be controlled by them or their relatives. Under the FATF's definition of PEPs, these relatives are also included within the PP category. Purchases or rentals of movable property by public officials that do not correspond to their declared income. This is something that has been observed worldwide, both in industrialized countries and in developing nations. The acquisition or rental of properties, usually luxury properties, that are entirely inconsistent with the income levels or declared wealth of the officials. Luxury goods purchases or payment for services made by the PEP, their relatives, or by a contracting authority or by a contractor after the awarding of a government contract. This is also a case we have seen quite commonly throughout the region and in other parts of the world. Close relatives or associates of public officials appointed to executive positions in private companies, once again as a way of rewarding favors and so on. These are typological elements, red flags that help precisely in the detection of this type of activity. And one more category related to public procurement and bidding processes. Services provided to state-owned companies by shell companies, offshore entities, or firms registered in high-risk jurisdictions. There's an interesting point I'd like to expand on. For example, the existence of specialized firms, as we mentioned earlier, that provide services to corporations by creating waves or groups of shell companies Every year, they continue creating and maintaining a stock of ready-to-use companies. For instance, to participate in public tenders, a certain number of years of experience is often required. Well, companies that were created years ago can be acquired, and in this way, the controls imposed by authorities, such as years of experience, are bypassed. In reality, these are shell companies that have simply been aging on a shelf for several years and have no actual experience providing the services they claim to offer. Long-term contracts suddenly awarded to the same subcontractor. Lack of competition in bidding processes. And this is something I'm sure Irma Eréndira and other colleagues are very, very familiar with. The fiction behind many bidding processes is very difficult to eradicate. In many cases, the processes are flawed. There is no real competition, which means there is no guarantee of obtaining the most competitive price, ultimately harming society through overpayment resulting from a poorly structured or otherwise compromised public tender. Subcontractors with directors or ultimate beneficiaries who are either the same as or related to those managing the main contractor. There are also many examples of such scandals, which Irma Eréndira has addressed extensively in her work and in several of her writings. So these are some of the indicators, some red flags that can be highlighted. The role of financial intelligence units, and this is something I consider fundamental, is central in anti-corruption efforts. First, through the generation of actionable intelligence. And here we return to what we discussed earlier. To the extent that financial intelligence units are supplied with value-added information from financial intermediaries, they can do their job more effectively. Second, they serve as the key mechanism for ensuring that cases can be brought to prosecution in a timely manner. That is, the financial intelligence unit receives information from intermediaries, as well as from other sources, but primarily from the reports submitted by financial institutions. In turn, they carry out the process of generating financial intelligence and refer the cases to other authorities, which are responsible for pursuing and handling the judicial aspects of these cases. Their mandates may vary depending on the country. There are many different types of financial intelligence units. And here, a fundamental aspect is the autonomy that financial intelligence units must have in order not to fall victim to pressure, whether from public or private actors. And this is something that forms part of international principles. The Egmont Group has established criteria for the autonomy of financial intelligence units. This critical component of anti-corruption efforts simply cannot function if it lacks a certain degree of independence and cannot carry out its work free from pressure. And this is something I believe Irma Eréndira has also shared in various forums. So these are some of the ideas I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much for your attention and your time. Once again, it is an honor to share this space with you, Irma Eréndira. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Enrique. You undoubtedly also offer important elements for reflection and analysis. And it's interesting that with your professional experience across several countries, you also believe it's necessary to rethink the methodologies and usefulness of corruption reports. This is understandable since corruption strategies and methods are constantly evolving and becoming increasingly sophisticated by the day. Even now, we see the use of these new technologies, such as artificial intelligence and other tools, that can be turned around and used for corrupt purposes. Well, Dr. Sandoval, we would like to hear your thoughts on the reflections Enrique has shared particularly regarding the practical relevance of the structural corruption approach in relation to current compliance frameworks, which are very much in vogue today. But we would also like to hear, I'll take this opportunity to pose a question regarding your theory of double fraud. In this symbiosis between electoral politics and financial economic power, what are the implications in contexts where financial crimes must be investigated within environments of political impunity? Thank you very much, Doctor.
Yes, thank you very much, Fernando. And above all, I'm truly grateful for the outstanding lecture Enrique has given us, with all his knowledge and expertise on these issues, so grounded in practical matters related to the fight against money laundering. And of course, on many other matters that are intrinsically linked to these topics. And indeed, I think there's a need to begin working more closely. I invite you at FININTEGRA. I'm fully committed to supporting this from our lab at UNAM to help ground this topic of PEPs, as they're called, right? Politically exposed persons in connection with the seed of democracy, which is the entire issue of electoral processes and the theory of double fraud. This would also be key to developing a more grounded approach to electoral oversight, directly tied to the fight against money laundering and the evasion of accountability. I believe one of most important reflections and lessons that Enrique gives us. The issues most closely connected to the theory of double fraud and to these topics of structural corruption include the autonomy that oversight bodies must have. They need to be shielded with true autonomy in order to genuinely go deep in the fight against impunity. And that ties directly into the issue of impunity itself, prevailing in terms of money laundering. So the autonomy of oversight bodies and of compliance officers, those who are entrusted with such important responsibilities, is essential. And impunity must be tackled in a more grounded, practical way. That is, as I mentioned, we need new criminal offenses, new financial crimes, directly tied to money laundering issues. Because the penalization of money laundering still seems to be in its infancy in Mexico. At times, much more complex criminal classifications are used, ones that are much harder to pursue. But this needs to be grounded in concrete penalties against money laundering, especially given its undeniable link to electoral processes and electoral oversight. So, on one hand, as I mentioned, autonomy, on the other, impunity. And the third major element, which I assume Enrique and of course Fernando will also agree with, has to do with secrecy. I believe that one of the most serious issues we still face in this major task of combating financial corruption and money laundering is the existence of secrecy. And I'm not referring only to banking secrecy or fiduciary and tax secrecy, which are clearly elements that should be dismantled through direct regulation against money laundering. But also, let's say, anonymous accounts, all the major elements Enrique has shared with us, which really need to be a central focus, right? I truly believe that the prohibition placed on banks from revealing names to the authorities is a serious obstacle to carrying out thorough investigations. So, as I was saying, I truly believe that autonomy, combating impunity, and above all, addressing secrecy are key. Because it's secrecy that creates these free zones, this intensive use of money laundering schemes. And obviously, as I mentioned, in electoral fraud, these types of fraud involve a wide range of such practices. The intensive use of cash for clientelism, for corporatism, the heavy use of transactions through prepaid cards or debit cards, in what you probably know better as smurfing, right? Where small amounts of money are distributed in large volumes. There's a direct connection here, and I believe that's something we could really expand upon. With the electoral fraud that occurs regularly in democracies, like ours, that are still striving to truly consolidate. And within these frameworks, we see such widespread abuses of power. So I do think it's very important to keep this in mind. As I mentioned earlier, one of the initiatives we pushed, and Fernando knows this well, was around Mexican whistleblowers. That's why I'm glad Enrique also emphasized it. We promoted a large-scale project aimed at supporting and protecting informants, whistleblowers. We implemented it through internal controls to gather information for combating corruption in administrative areas and, more broadly, corruption in general. But within public life, I believe we still lack whistleblowers in the financial sphere. It would be essential to have them, but under a legal framework. That is, a federal-level law, or if not that, then at least efforts at the local level to push for more grounded laws that support and protect the fundamental rights of whistleblowers or informants. And that ties back to what we were saying about secrecy. Combating secrecy. I think that's one of the things I'm most proud of from my time in public service. How for the first time in decades, we implemented internal whistleblower programs, what we called Mexican whistleblowers. And on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier in this talk, there's also the issue of conflict of interest laws. But in this case, specifically focused on financial conflicts of interest, because as Enrique clearly pointed out in his very precise presentation, there is this direct connection involving the relatives of political subordinates. And I see it even more clearly in the political electoral realm. Right? There is always that laundering of funds tied to direct conflicts of interest. So I really do believe that these modalities are also important to confront. And another fundamental point is, of course, recognizing that the other side of the money laundering coin is the issue of taxation. That is, tax havens. And that's why, as I emphasized in my initial remarks, combating low levels of tax collection in our country, in our homeland, is essential. Unfortunately, that has also been a major obstacle to fully advancing the fight against money laundering, and of course, has hindered your work as financial oversight actors, or guardians of financial legality, so to speak. I believe that beyond the concrete, and we could say ominous, criminal repercussions involved in money laundering and this type of fraud, there are also political effects, which I would now describe as structural consequences of money laundering. There are repercussions that are closely tied to democracy and to the integrity of financial markets, particularly in terms of trust. It is often said that we are a society that is not well banked, that many people don't want to have credit or debit cards, and that they prefer to hide their small savings under the mattress. But that is a direct effect of this lack of financial integrity, which is also evident today when financial oversight and anti-money laundering efforts are not taken to their full extent. Because there is a weakening of financial market integrity that leads people to lose trust in those who are supposed to safeguard their money. So it's a very direct socio-political effect. The erosion of trust in banks. Obviously, there are even greater political consequences, such as the loss of control over economic and fiscal policies, as I mentioned earlier. That's why I truly believe there's much to be done in terms of fostering more direct interaction between these socio-political approaches and the more practical approaches to combating corruption.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Without a doubt, this emphasis on the need to fight impunity is critically important, especially as it relates to combating corruption. As you always say, impunity is the Siamese twin of corruption. And Enrique, you also spoke, as Dr. Sandoval rightly pointed out, about conflicts of interest, and she herself emphasized the need to strengthen financial integrity. In that regard, Enrique, I'd like to ask you, based on your experience, how can institutions within the financial system contribute to strengthening integrity, especially in context of institutional weakness?
Look, thank you very much, Fernando, for the question. This very aspect of institutional weakness is, I believe, what needs to be emphasized. And we can see it in many ways, right? For example, when oversight entities or supervisory bodies lack the necessary resources or are somehow co-opted by other interests, it significantly weakens both the oversight function and the function of transparency. I believe that in this regard, financial institutions themselves must first strengthen their compliance procedures, reinforce the resources allocated to those areas, and at the same time, there should also be, in the public sphere, a strengthening of those oversight authorities. I was reading some recent reports pointing out precisely the budget cuts for some of these oversight entities. In short, they're struggling in many cases to be able to do their job properly. I think it's important to keep this in mind and to strengthen precisely the entities that are responsible for safeguarding integrity throughout the entire system, both in the public and private spheres.
Thank you very much, Enrique. We'd also like to take this moment to invite the webinar participants to send us any questions via the chat. Later on, we'll have the opportunity to pose them to our guests, our speakers. And if there's not enough time to address them during the session, we'll be sure to forward them to our speakers so they can respond at a later stage, if possible. And in this part of integrity, Dr. Sandoval, I remember that when we were at the Secretariat of Public Administration, you used the term public ministries of integrity to refer precisely to the auditors, to the staff of the Secretariat. Do you think this term can also be used for compliance officers?
Hello, yes, it's ready. Yes, definitely. I believe that one of the most generous and committed roles is that of the compliance officer in the private sector. In the financial realm, I truly see them as top-level professionals with strong ethical credentials. And as Enrique rightly says, we send them to war sometimes without a rifle, meaning without independence, without autonomy, and without the necessary resources, especially political shielding, and that's how public prosecutors are in the criminal sphere, right? So I do believe that on their shoulders rests the responsibility to uphold this guarantee Enrique mentioned of compliance, of the enforcement of internal rules, ethical standards, and direct prevention of crimes and financial distortions. And that's why they're heroic. That was what inspired us. Fernando, do you remember that initiative around the Mexican whistleblowers or anti-corruption informants? I mean, they are heroes because they have no one to protect them. And here, we are going to stand up for their rights. At the very least, their fundamental labor and civil rights, when they take that brave step to speak up. And that's why I also, without knowing in depth, like you two, what a compliance officer's work entails. Based on this excellent presentation and everything they're tasked with, I truly believe they carry the same positive ethical weight that I attribute to our public auditors in Mexico.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And precisely in these initiatives that you led from the Secretariat of Public Administration, well, the creation of the General Coordination for Victims of Corruption was something truly innovative, something that didn't exist before, and honestly, I don't know if it still does. But it was a strong push aimed specifically at addressing, let's say, the harmful effects of corruption on citizens. Doctor, in your book on structural corruption, you speak of the Heptagon of integrity as a proposed framework of systems that should be implemented to build an effective system for combating corruption. In this Heptagon, you speak of several systems: the oversight system, the control system, and so on. What role would the fight against money laundering play within this Heptagon of integrity you describe in your work?
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. We promoted this idea of, let's say, the Me Too of corruption. I remember that. But, well, that's a borrowed term, an Anglo expression from the English language, me too. But that was the idea. Corruption has affected all of us so deeply that just like the Me Too movement, in terms of harassment and how we, as women, live in a patriarchal society, it generated such momentum and participation, even internationally. My idea was precisely that corruption is the same. I mean, we are all victims in one way or another, whether we are in the state, in the market, or in society. We are all victims, and that's why we must join forces, each of us from our own roles, as business people, as workers, as public officials, or as citizens, in order, first and foremost, to fight impunity. Because as Fernando rightly says, we see it as inseparably bound to corruption, its twin sister. And that's why we used to say we were fed up with those three systems, because corruption was being framed in this tripartite way: the transparency system, the auditing system, and the accountability system, right? Even the national anti-corruption system itself was built around that three-part structure. But I didn't talk about systems. I talked about subsystems. I said we needed one single system made up of various subsystems. And as Fernando rightly said, these were the 7 sides of this heptagon, starting with the public procurement subsystem, instead of something as vague as transparency or accountability or general auditing. I said we need to name things clearly, give them first and last names, say exactly what we're tackling when we talk about integrity. That's what we called the heptagon of administrative integrity. With the governmental accounting subsystem, the public accounts, the governmental accounts, the auditing subsystem, obviously, where all the comptrollers are, the professionalization subsystem, which is the public function, the subsystem, I said, for combating impunity, which is central. This is where everyone comes in, those who impose administrative sanctions, but also criminal ones. And now we're also saying financial penalties, too. There should be special sanctions of that kind. So the subsystem for combating impunity, that is for punishment. The transparency and accountability system does need to be there because it's about basic information, which is also a constitutional right, public information, and basic data. And another subsystem, one that rarely gets proper attention but is crucial, is the one related to public debt. The subsystem of budgeting and public debt, which has to be distinct from public accounts. Because the public account is one thing, but public debt, that's a whole different matter. It's a hotbed of corruption in our country, generally speaking. On top of that, a lot of assets get slipped in there, even financial ones and others that aren't technically public debt, but we all end up having to pay for them. So it's an important issue. So that was my idea. And I really think that when it comes to these issues of money laundering and capital laundering, well, the emphasis needs to be placed across every side of that heptagon, right? The emphasis has to be there.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Honestly, we could spend entire days here. It's always a pleasure to hear these kinds of reflections and to be part of spaces like this. However, our time is running out. So we have a question from one of the participants, and with this question, which I'll direct to both of our speakers, we'll be wrapping up. From my point of view, it's a complex question. The question is, why haven't international organizations been able to combat corruption? And this also leads me to reflect on some current theories that argue corruption isn't something you fight. It's something you manage, right? So, what's your opinion, Doctor? Sandoval, Enrique Nort. First, on the role of international organizations in the fight against corruption and why they haven't achieved meaningful results in countries like in Latin American countries? And second, what's your view on these theories that say corruption can only be controlled? Thank you. I don't know who would like to respond first.
Go ahead, Irma Eréndira, please.
Thank you very much. You're the expert here, but we'll try to take a swing at this. As Fernando rightly pointed out, it's a complex one. I'm actually very optimistic, both about democracy and the fight against corruption, despite all the challenges. I truly believe we must hold the conviction that we can build a better democracy, that we can confront the double fraud, and that corruption can, in fact, be fought. Even though it's structural and deeply functional to a kind of democracy that enables fraud on both fronts, the status quo doesn't have to last forever, right? And that status quo is marked by a great deal of opacity, impunity, and a lack of civic voice. But this isn't forever. So the idea that corruption can only be controlled but not truly fought, that's not my view. That's not the flag I wave. On the contrary, I believe progress has been made. I can say with a clear conscience that we did a lot while we were there, and that we're still doing the work from our own trenches, and we'll keep doing it. Yes, is there still a long way to go? Absolutely. There are still many needs to be addressed. But we implemented, and Fernando knows this well, very different practices, even different standards for administrative sanctions. Different jurisprudential theses that we pushed forward, new judicial criteria, new oversight standards. So yes, with the political will, it can be done. And of course, what's still needed is more power, more legality, and more integrity. That's the ongoing fight. That, let's say, is a starting point for the call to action you're giving us, Fernando. And the international aspect is also a very important part of this broader vision, of the integrity heptagon, and of the historical moment we're living through. I do believe the world is changing, and yes, new pathways have opened that allow financial flows to sometimes also enable these frauds, these financial deceptions, these illegal activities. But indeed, as the world is changing, there are also new practices, new controls, and new technologies that if we adopt them, if we make them citizen-driven, and if we put them on the side of anti-corruption awareness, they can really help us, right? Why doesn't this change at the international level? Clearly, it's because it's profitable, it serves certain interests, and of course, we have to keep fighting against those. It's more of a conversation starter, but I'd rather take this last opportunity to truly thank you for this excellent chance to share and exchange with such great experts. It was also a real honor for me, Enrique, to be in direct dialogue with you and with all the colleagues at FININTEGRA. Milady, it's a real pleasure. And of course, with my dear Fernando, who knows that through him and through all of you, we're at your service to continue these conversations and civic projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Of course, we'll take you up on that offer, and we'll definitely look for more engagement and generate more projects, precisely to foster what you just mentioned, anti-corruption awareness. Thank you so much. And Enrique, your closing thoughts, please.
Thank you, Fernando. Well, I'd just like to add a brief comment regarding the last question we were asked about the role of international organizations. I believe that here, at least when it comes to money laundering, but I think it applies to many other areas as well. International organizations are mainly the ones that set the guidelines, the standards, the principles we should aspire to as societies, as nations. But it's the countries themselves and their authorities that are responsible for implementing and grounding those recommendations. So when it comes to fighting corruption, it's not so much the role of international organizations to combat it directly, but rather the responsibility of each country's authorities to put those recommendations into practice and to actively fight corruption. But the fight against corruption, at least the way I see it, goes far beyond being just a government responsibility. It's a responsibility shared by society as a whole. I truly believe that as citizens, we all bear the responsibility of combating corruption. It's not so much a matter for international organizations. They set the tone, they define the principles. But from there, it's up to all of us to carry that fight forward against both corruption and money laundering. That would be my final thought. And once again, I want to thank everyone, especially Irma Eréndira, our colleagues at FININTEGRA, and all the participants for the opportunity to come together and share knowledge in this space.
Thank you very much, Enrique. Without a doubt, your contributions and this perspective on strengthening the financial system have been truly enriching. I also want to extend a very special thanks to the students of the Master's Program in Analysis and Prevention of Corruption at the International University of La Rioja, Spain, for joining us here today. Of course, to the compliance officers from various Ibero-American countries, and to some members of internal control bodies in different agencies and entities of the federal public administration, and in general to all the people who joined, listened, and remained attentive to this event and responded to this call. Thank you very much. To close, I now give the floor to the General Director of FININTEGRA, Milady Bernal Campos, for her closing remarks at this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Thank you, Dr. Sandoval, and thank you, Enrique. It has been a pleasure and truly a very rich and meaningful conversation. We will take you up on that offer to establish this connection with FININTEGRA and explore how we can deepen our knowledge and understanding of corruption and how to deliver that knowledge in the form of what we call actionable intelligence to compliance officers and to everyone else. Tasked with fighting and preventing money laundering and the financing of terrorism. Thank you all. This has been our first webinar. This is how we're making our public debut at FININTEGRA, so we couldn't have a better ally, I'll say it. A better ally than someone who has devoted herself to fighting corruption and who understands it from multiple dimensions. So thank you all. Please join our LinkedIn page as well. That way you'll stay tuned and get notifications about everything we're working on. Once again, thank you very much and good afternoon. See you next time.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you.